Well, thank you very much for joining me in this video. I want to talk to you today about spousal consent when it comes to common law relationships. Received a phone call from one of my agents the other day. She was in the process of listing a home, and the couple had lived in the home for years and years, but it was only in the male spouse's name. And the question she wanted to know was, did it require spousal consent in order to list the property? So we need to talk about the matrimonial home for a minute. In most cases, when you've got husband and wife living in a house, the matrimonial home, it's generally in both names. And when it's in both names, they're in joint tenancy rather than tenancy in common, and that means it has the right of survivorship. If one of the spouses passes away, it automatically reverts to the other person. It's clean, it's simple, it's in both names. But what about if it's not in both names? Let's suppose it's just in the husband's name. Under the Family Law Reform Act, there's protection for the spouse in the matrimonial home if that spouse isn't actually registered on title. What it says is that the home cannot be encumbered or disposed of without spousal consent. And that's meant to protect the interest of the other party. You see, in the matrimonial home, whether both parties are on title or not, both have an interest in that property. And therefore, the one spouse can't put a great big mortgage against it or sell it without the other spouse's consent. So they have to have independent legal advice. And independent legal advice is there because the one spouse may be browbeaten by the other. I mean, the typical stereotype you have is a husband has got his wife under his thumb. He wants to put a large mortgage on the property because he wants to take a holiday, he wants to buy a boat, whatever, or he wants to sell it, downsize, move somewhere else. And the remaining spouse really isn't happy with that, doesn't want her equity sold away or diminished by a mortgage. So she gets independent legal advice. She can put her foot down and say no. Now, of course, I don't know what will happen to the marriage relationship. That's a whole other issue. That's what happens with the matrimonial home. But back to our original question. When you're dealing with common law relationships, there is no matrimonial home. They are in a home, they are sharing the family home, but it's not a matrimonial home because there was no matrimony. And because of that, there really isn't the protection that the spouse would have under the Family Law Reform Act. Some years ago, I had a cottage up in Halliburton, in a lake with about 75 people on it, and I decided to create a cottage directory. And so I was phoning everybody on the lake and getting all their information so I could put it in this kind of like a phone book directory. And one chap on the lake I called, and he shared with me his situation. He said, you know, my wife, he used the term wife, common law wife it turned out. He said, my wife was ailing for the last 15 to 20 years with Alzheimer's, and then she passed away. And she told me I could live in the house for the rest of my life, but that's not the case. The kids are kicking me out of the house and they're kicking me out of the cottage. I guess they weren't as endeared to him as the wife was. But the point is they were able to do that. And he said, she told me I could stay in it as long as I want. Well, she told him that, but it wasn't enforceable. It can only be enforceable if there's either a court order or if there's an enforceable agreement of some sort. And if there isn't one or the other, there is no right to stay. So what can be done about it? Well, you're not going to get the protection of the matrimonial home under the Family Law Reform Act. You don't require spousal consent to dispose of it or encumber it. But there is another possibility in addition to an enforceable agreement or court order, and that's the principle of unjust enrichment. And the principle of unjust enrichment is if somebody else is benefiting unjustly because of what I've done, I deserve compensation for that. And so there can be an argument in there if a spouse has been in that house for years and they put a lot of money in to renovate it and repair it, not just to service the mortgage because that's the equivalent of rent, but if they can show that they put a lot, and even sweat equity, they can show that they've put a lot in, then they can argue in the courts that they were entitled to some protection or some remuneration when the house sells. It's a tough uphill battle. They have to prove it, but there is that possibility. But understand, there isn't spousal consent required in a common law relationship, and there's no automatic protection under the Family Law Reform Act. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video. Talk to you again next week.